Good afternoon. My name is Lynn Libben, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate today's session in a Views by Two session, and to welcome you to what promises to be, I think, a very exciting, interesting time. As you know, the session is entitled Starting Points and Change in Spatial Development. It would be difficult, actually, to imagine finding a member of SRCD who would not be interested in these topics. It's clearly at the core of what developmental scientists do. But starting points really aren't all that obvious. Historically, developmentalists proposed that babies' starting points were quite limited. And it's only been during the last couple of decades, a little more, that our journals and the media have really been filled with reports about how young infants, sometimes even neonates, have perceptual capacities, knowledge, skills, reasoning that are more sophisticated than William James or Jean Piaget or even the parent on the street might have imagined possible. Our first speaker today, Elizabeth Spelke, has been at the forefront of stories about remarkable babies. Has highlighted in the brief description, let's see if I can make this work, yes, that is in the program for those of you who either looked at it online or printed it out. Her work has focused on origins and nature of knowledge of objects, actions, number, social relationships, and the particular focus of this afternoon's session, geometry. Liz, too, of course, has her own starting points and changes. She received her BA in social relations at Radcliffe, followed by a year at Yale, after which she entered the PhD program at my alma mater, Cornell. Before the ink was even dry on her diploma, she was publishing her research and has been a prolific and influential figure ever since. It would be quite impossible to begin to capture the breadth and excellence of her publication record without going over my allotted introductory time. Even I was told exactly how many minutes I had. Perhaps it's enough to say that Dr. Spelke has published often and in the very best journals, not only in developmental science, including our own child development, but also in journals like Cognition, the Journal of Neuroscience, Experimental Brain Research, that represent the best of other disciplines as well. And her work has appeared in the best science journals that go to broad audiences, such as Science, Nature, PNAS. The honors that are listed in the program also are only among the many she's received. She's also received honorary degrees from Sweden, France, and the Netherlands, an NIH Merit Award, and election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. Now, I realize that these awards and accomplishments are really what is probably impressing everybody, but as someone who has subscribed to the New Yorker since 1964, I was only in elementary school, really. What really impresses me is that her work was profiled in the New Yorker, and I highly recommend the article if you haven't seen it. But if Liz Spelke is the personification of the origins part of the presentation, or the session today, Nora Newcombe is the personification of spatial development. Her research in this area began emerging even as a graduate student while she was also studying memory, and she's actually maintained both of those interests and contributed incredibly. My familiarity with the excellence of Nora's work has been much more up close and personal because when I was on the faculty in human development at Penn State, Nora joined the faculty in psychology. And at that time, we ended up collaborating some on spatial research. We were part of an interdisciplinary faculty seminar on space, which had philosophers and geographers and all sorts of people. And we often would compare notes and even agreed about many things that were going on, including the wine. We had one wine buff. And we were co-organizers of a conference on spatial representation and behavior that took place at Penn State. In her years, I should really get your picture up there. In the years that Nora's been at Temple since leaving Penn State, she's also been incredibly prolific, working on both issues of memory and space. Her contributions, too, have been voluminous. They've appeared in top-tier publication outlets and have a powerful impact in developmental and cognitive science, and in some other fields as well. Among the honors she has received from her work include the G. Stanley Hall Award for Distinguished Contributions to Developmental Psychology, the James McKeel Cattell Fellowship, election to the Society of Experimental Psychologists, and to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. But I think I would probably be remiss if I were not to also mention receipt of the coveted Faculty of the Game Award at Temple as well. During the last several years, Nora's also increasingly directed her attention to bridging basic developmental science and the educational world. She's an eloquent spokesperson for the role of spatial education, irrespective of whether she's addressing parents, writing for daycare providers, talking to members of Congress, or her research colleagues. Her contributions to developmental science, and indeed to cognitive science, neuroscience, learning science, and more, have been made not only by her own scholarship, but also by her leadership in many positions. She served many roles, including editorial roles, as the associate editor of Psych Bulletin, Perspectives on Psychological Science, and she was editor-in-chief of Journal of Experimental Psychology General. She served as president of a number of organizations, including EPA, Division 7 of APA, and the Cognitive Development Society. Most germane to the topic of today's session, Nora has spearheaded a successful application to NSF to receive one of the coveted Science of Learning centers, and she established the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center. And in this role, she's really made spatial cognition a very huge part of our field. Finally, Nora, too, well, maybe it's not finally, but the last thing I'll say, has met my personal criterion of having appeared in The New Yorker. I will leave you to discover that particular article, for those of you who are interested. We'll begin today with Liz Spelke's presentation, which is entitled Natural Geometry. She will have 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to Nora's 30-minute presentation entitled Adaptive Combination in Spatial Development. The program committee has joined these talks into the Views by Twos format, in part because Liz and Nora have not necessarily seen eye to eye on everything in the past. And although it is not technically a debate, I could not help but contemplating the session, thinking about, that's the titles, thinking about this, and in my mind it kind of morphed into that. But I feared also thinking about that particular situation, this, and figured I was going to be in that position. I figured it was only fair to do it to myself as well. So, as a consequence, we will have some ground rules, which is 30 minutes for each of the talks. We will follow it by questions, and I did put the kind with question marks, not major statements. And I do reserve the right to use the hook if necessary. So we will begin, and please join me in welcoming first Dr. Liz Spelke for her talk. I think that should be you. Yes, okay. Super.
Am I doing this right, Steve? Thank you so much. First of all, Lynn, for, oops, this isn't working. I'll use this, for organizing this exchange. But second and foremost, thanks to Nora. Nora, you've given me, I think, the best gift that a scientific colleague can give. For decades, you've been conducting beautiful experiments. We've been looking at the same data, and we've been coming at it from different perspectives. And I have felt consistently over this time that my work has benefited enormously from your own perspective on it, as well as from the great work that you've been doing. So here, let me start with something that I'm virtually certain Nora and I agree on, that Euclidean geometry is an extremely important system of rules and principles that we use for almost everything, from measuring time and space to understanding and making inferences about the structure of the universe, for the development of art, for the development of formal mathematics. And it's also, teaching of geometry is a critical goal for education. But knowledge of geometry is in some ways quite puzzling. The system of Euclidean plane geometry is extremely simple. You can capture all of the properties of the points, lines, and figures on the Euclidean plane with 5 simple postulates plus a few rules of logic. But the objects at the center of Euclidean geometry, points that are so small they have no size, lines that are so straight and so long that they have no end, these are objects that no perceptual system could ever apprehend, that no action system could ever encompass. Yet they seem utterly intuitive to us. So how do we come to have this strange set of concepts? Well, perhaps because they're so interesting, people have been studying them for a long time. In philosophy, the study of Euclidean geometry goes back about 2.5 millennia, as Nora observed. In the history, the 100-plus-year-old history of the experimental study of animal behavior within psychology and within evolutionary biology, people have been looking at navigation tasks in mazes or in real environments from the beginning. Since the beginning of research in neurophysiology, people have been asking what the properties are of neurons in the brain that detect geometric properties of visual arrays or geometric properties of the arrays that we navigate through. And this has also been a recurring topic in the fields of robotics and, of course, fields closer to home focused on human cognition and human cognitive development. With all this work, there's a lot to draw on, but some fundamental questions are still, I think, wide open. And here are a few at the center of discussion today. What are the starting points for spatial cognitive development? What changes over development and what's constant? In what ways are human spatial representations the same as those of other animals, and in what ways are they different? And finally, how do we come to have these strange, abstract geometrical intuitions, and how can we foster them in our educational system? Well, my own approach starts with a few first-pass assumptions. The first assumption is that although abstract geometry has a long history measured on the scale of human recorded history, it has a very short history measured on evolutionary timescales, probably too short for us to have some special purpose module or system in our brains that's devoted to the task of reasoning about dimensionless points and infinitely long lines. Instead, I think when we learn and practice geometry, we take capacities that evolved for other purposes and we harness them for this new purpose. Now, if that's true, a crucial question will be, what is the nature of those capacities? And here, I think we can draw on a broad array of disciplines to shed light on that question. They tend to fall into 4 different comparative approaches. One looks at spatial cognition across different animal species, asking what's the same and what's different when different species are given similar tasks. Another looks across time in human development, again, probing for continuities and changes in spatial cognitive abilities. A third looks across people living in different cultures or different historical times, or confronting the world with different sets of capacities and different access to information. And a fourth looks across levels of analysis. And at this point, there's a rich array of levels to look at, from molecules to neurons to brain systems to computations. Extrapolating wildly from all 4 of these sources, here's the view I want to present today, that Euclidean geometry is founded on at least 2 distinct core systems. One is a system for representing geometric properties of the large-scale layout that we navigate in. The other is a system for representing geometric properties of small-scale objects. Now, this is not a novel claim that I'm making today. I've put here just a tiny set of people, one of whom at least is in this room, who have made such claims in the past. But what I want to make more specific today is the way in which each of these systems could both contribute to but also falls short of full-blown Euclidean geometry. In particular, I think each of these systems captures some, but not all, Euclidean relations. And what's more, although explicit abstract Euclidean geometry is consciously accessible to us and available for use in many, many different tasks, each of these core systems is much more restricted and indeed passes many tests for modularity, some of which I'll be pointing out as I go along. Now, that's the first half of the proposal. The second half is that children go beyond these systems, the limits of these systems, and build more abstract geometrical concepts by combining productively the outputs of these core systems. And these combinations, I think, depend on two kinds of symbol systems that are unique to humans. One is natural language, which I will not talk about today. I'm in danger of running out of time even without talking about language. The other, which I will try to say something about, are spatial symbols, especially pictures and maps. So let me start with the first core system of geometry that is called on by us and other animals when we have to navigate through the layout, maintaining a sense of where we are with respect to the larger spatial layout. And I'll begin with a set of classic experiments conducted by Ken Cheng and Randy Gallistel, where they asked what kind of information will a navigating rat use to reestablish its sense of place. So in these studies, rats were hungry rats were brought into a novel rectangular chamber where they saw food partially buried but partially visible in one corner of the room. But before the rats could eat the food and satisfy their hunger, the mean experimenters picked them up and put them in a box, spun the box around until they were disoriented, and meanwhile either buried the food so they couldn't be seen anymore or else actually removed it from the chamber, and then released the rats to go search for it. And what they reported in this first study was that rats tended to distribute their search between two locations: the correct location where the food had actually been seen to be buried, and the opposite corner of the room, a corner that differed from the correct location in a bunch of ways, including the shapes of patterns that were presented near the food, but that shared the room's overall geometry. In this case, these are both corners to the left of a shorter, more distant wall. So this study, from this study, they drew two conclusions: that rats can reorient by the shape of the surrounding layout, and that they fail to reorient by small geometric patterns or other cues that would have distinguished those two corners. Now, they went on to ask, does this failure occur because rats simply can't see those corners or learn to use them? And to address that question, Ken Cheng, in this first much-cited paper, went on to do a training study. And in the training study, he took the same rat and tested the rat again and again over time, always with food buried in the same location. And what he found was that over training, rats came to confine their digging to that single correct location. This supported the conclusion that rats could detect and learn to use the landmarks. But because they responded to the shape of the room immediately without learning and automatically on first entering it, whereas the conditions for responding to the landmark were different, Cheng concluded that a separate process was involved in learning to use the landmark relative to reorienting to the shape of the room. And he and Gallistel went further to propose that there was this modular system for reorientation. Well, that was a long time ago. Since then, lots and lots of studies have been done on many different animals, many of those studies beautifully reviewed by Nora and Ken Cheng some time ago. I want to just talk about one other animal that's been studied. It's this small ant with this rather large and terrifying name, Gigantiops destructor. This is an ant that lives in the Amazon, and it forages for leaves and then brings them back to its nest. And the investigators used this ability to test what would happen if the ant were disoriented. So this is a situation in which, if the ant were oriented, the nest is over here. She would simply leave through this corner. But she's in an environment where there's actually openings in all 4 corners, and also distinctive landmarks. And for 4 days, she's oriented, sees the landmark, sees the environment, and always leaves through that one corner. But then, when she's disoriented, she does what the rats do and divides her exits between those 2 corners. And then they went on to ask, well, can we train her and other ants to only use the single correct corner? So they blocked off the other exits and gave the ant 4 days of training. And after 4 days of training, indeed like the rats, the ant would only leave through this one corner. But if you look at the paths, what seems to be engaged is 2 different processes in sequence. First, a tendency to approach both of these 2 corners about equally often. But second, before actually trying to go through one of these exits, looking up, checking the landmark, and then when it's the wrong one, making a U-turn and going the other way. So again, I think evidence for 2 separate processes here, one reorienting by layout geometry, the other focusing on beacon landmarks. Notice, though, that in this case, both the landmarks and the shape of the room are captured by what we would call abstract Euclidean geometry, but they're being engaged separately in this situation. Well, before the ant studies, after the rat studies, we started studying this in human children. I undertook these studies because I was sure that children were going to look different from rats in all of these respects, and hoped that maybe that difference would give us clues to what's unique about human spatial representation, but that's not how things turned out. We found that children also reorient primarily by the shape of the room, not by toys of theirs that have been put in the room near the correct but not the incorrect size, not by a colored wall, but like Chang, we found we could induce children after they were disoriented to use landmark objects, and you didn't even need to train them to do it. If you hid something directly in one of these objects, then a disoriented child would go to it. Or if you presented a child, as Nora and others had shown, if you presented a child with a large room that had an enormous colored wall on it instead of a smaller colored wall, the enormous wall would grab their attention, and if you hid something near it, then they would use the colored wall as well. Subsequent work showed that children are sensitive to the shape of a room, not only in this original rectangular case, but in other cases as well. And this work, I think, accords with the findings from the animals that there are 2 distinct systems at work in children, one for reorienting by the shape of the overall layout of extended surfaces, and the other for homing in on landmark objects, like a distinctive object or a colored wall. So further work by Sang-Ah Lee started to ask, well, what counts as surface layout? What kinds of geometrical information can a child respond to? And she was a little dissatisfied with the earlier studies that had all used enclosed rooms, so she asked what would happen if we presented a child with a uniform cylindrical environment and then put a rectangular structure within that room that they could see over, but that consisted nevertheless of extended surfaces. She found children could use this when surfaces were low enough that they could see over them or step over them, and in fact, even when an array of surfaces was only 2 centimeters off the ground, either with an abrupt rise or a gradual rise. On the other hand, when she replaced these 3-dimensional structures with a 2-dimensional pattern, like a set of black electrical tape lines attached to the floor, or a flat black rectangle just placed flush on the floor, now children did not use that information to reorient. Instead, they did something kind of interesting. If a sticker was hidden under one corner of this black rectangle, they would search only in the corners, showing that they detected the rectangle. If the rectangle hadn't been there, the best they would have been able to do would be to search somewhere on a circle in this circular room. So they detected the rectangle, but they searched at the 4 corners equally, showing that they weren't using the shape of the rectangle to guide their search in this situation the way they did up here or here. And the same thing was shown with an array of freestanding objects. So it looks like children reorient by rather subtle perturbations in the ground surface, but not by 2D contrast borders or freestanding objects. I'm going to have to move more quickly, so let me just say this pattern of findings is not unique to humans. You see it in chicks, which is good news because then you can do controlled rearing studies, which I won't have time to talk about. But it raises a question. And the question is, what information are the children and possibly other animals extracting when they're disoriented in a rectangular room? And for 20 years, I thought the answer to this question was obvious. They were extracting information about the length of the walls, and they were extracting information in, for example, a rhombic-shaped room about the angles at the corners. However, there's another possible description of these two environments that has to do not with wall lengths or corner angles, but with distances. The distinctive aspect ratio of this room that makes two of the walls more distant from the child when the child's at the center than the other two walls are, and similarly in the rhombic room. So children could be reorienting by the relationship left of the more distant angle or corner rather than left of the shorter wall or the narrower corner. So Sang Ali did research to distinguish these two possibilities. Here are a couple of her environments. What you see here are two environments where walls are equal in length, so there's no length information. And the corners have been taken away, so there's no corner angle information. But the distinctive aspect ratio, the distinctive distances is preserved. And children were found to use that information, just about as well as they used a fully connected rectangular room. She also did the symmetrical experiment that took away the distance information but left the distinctive wall lengths and the distinctive corner angles. Children failed in both conditions of that study. So it looks like I owe you all an apology if you've heard me talk about this stuff before, because I probably said that people reorient by left of the long wall. Turns out not to be true. Left of the closer wall or right of the more distant wall. It's distance and direction, not length and angle, that's guiding children's reorientation. Final question. Suppose we keep that distinctive aspect ratio and vary whether what's presented is an array of continuous surfaces, as here, or whether what's presented is four corner angles occupying the same total amount of surface area but presented at the corners rather than in the middle of the array. I was convinced it would make no difference looked at from an overhead view like I'm showing here. Those both look like the same rhombic shape, but children succeeded in that case and they failed in that case, showing that as children are navigating, they're treating these two, what look from the perspective of Euclidean geometry as equivalent configurations, they're treating them differently, navigating by extended surfaces, not by corners. And this also is not unique to humans. Zebrafish show exactly the same patterns, responding to distance, not length, distance and direction, not length and angle, and responding to extended surfaces, not corners. I think that's good news for anyone who wants to go out and do genetics of spatial cognition. They're a good animal to do that in. Now, in retrospect, I think these results should not have surprised us. For a long time, people have been studying navigation from a different perspective, looking at the firing properties of so-called place cells in the hippocampus of navigating rats. And to make a long and interesting story very, very short, these cells fire when an animal is in a particular place where place is defined by distance and direction to two or more walls in the room. You see that response to distance and direction by experiments that first find a place cell like this and then alter the distance relationships or directional relationships to the walls. You also find that place cells don't care at all about the color of a wall, about the properties of objects that are placed in the room. Their firing is unaffected by changes in those properties. And finally, they don't really care about room shape, if by shape we mean things like relative length and angle. This room has the same shape as this one, but they're preserving distance to the nearby walls, not location within that overall shape. What's more, experiments show that you can cut the corners off one of these rooms, and the place cells don't care at all. They're not tracking position relative to corners. Now, research on baby rats shows that these firing patterns emerge very early in rats, consistent with the evidence from development in human infants. And further research shows that the problem is not that these animals are oblivious to corner angles or to landmark objects. Rather, there are other brain systems that encode those sources of information, particularly in studies that recruit animals' attention or that give animals training. Now, these representations finally can also be found in adult humans. This was shown by the same laboratory that did some of the rat place cell studies in a virtual navigation task where adults are navigating by moving a joystick so as to find and then reposition an object which is encountered at a particular spatial relationship both to a boundary and to a landmark. And to see how much adults were using either the boundary or the landmark, when they had to replace the object, these two cues were moved with respect to each other. So now you could chart on any given trial how much are they using the boundary, how much are they using the landmark, and what part of the brain is active in each case. And in these adults, on trials where they're using more, where their placement more often depends more on the boundary, you see activation of the hippocampus, just like in the rats. This extended surface here. On trials where it depends on the landmark, you see activation of different brain areas, the ones that are also activated in rats, responding to landmarks. So evidence that these two distinct systems exist in us as well. Now, this looks like a big convergence between studies of reorientation and studies of using neurophysiological methods in adults and other animals, but is there a direct relationship between them? Research by E. Huang tried to address this question by taking the same group of adults in our lab and testing them both on this boundary task that I just described, and also on a virtual reorientation task where you're just looking at a room, a rectangular room, and it spins around. But we were worried by the virtual reorientation task because it involves no active motion. And studies on rats say that the hippocampal system is only activated when you're active. So we also tested people in a real reorientation task in a real rectangular room where they were turning around, measuring placement errors in the first task, the boundary task, and the geometrically correct choices in the two reorientation tasks. And 48 adults were given all of these tasks. The first finding was that real and virtual reorientation were not related to each other. I think you really need to move around in a room in order to encode the these relations of surfaces. On the other hand, real reorientation was related to accuracy on the boundary task. So active motion in a virtual array did seem to be working to elicit this very same system that we see in a real reorientation task. So geometry for navigation seems to be activated in both of these situations. So to summarize, this first system seems to be widespread across animals, shared by both infants and adults, children and adults, emerging early in childhood, but it falls short of full Euclidean geometry. It doesn't respond to two-dimensional surface markings, doesn't respond to corners of a room, responds to distance and direction, but not length or angle. What's more, this system seems to operate without our being much aware of it, and I'll give you no evidence beyond the simple anecdote that I, for 20 years, ran myself in these studies and confidently described what I was doing as reorienting with respect to the lengths of walls until I was forced by the data from navigating rats and navigating adults and Sang Ali's own data in my lab to conclude I was mistaken about that. Okay, if that were the only system of core geometry, it's hard to see how we would get to Euclidean geometry. But there's a second system that we and other animals, like this ant who discovers over here that he better turn around, a second system for representing properties of the shapes of objects. And because I'm very low on time, I will describe this very quickly. It begins to act in infancy. We have evidence, we meaning many labs have evidence of infants responding to the sameness of an angle over changes in orientation and a difference between that angle and another angle. Nora has beautiful studies showing infants respond to sameness or difference in length. In contrast, when we analyze the shapes of visual forms, forms, we tend not to be sensitive to the distinction between a form and its mirror image, so-called sense or left-right directional information. We showed both of these effects in studies of adults and children in 2 cultures where we presented them with a whole bunch of different trials where they saw 5 arrays that had the same geometric property and a 6th array that had different properties. And across these trials, we find the same arrays are easy across cultures and across ages, and the same arrays are hard. The easy ones are cases in which the outlying form differs from the others in angle or in length relations. The hard ones are the ones where the outlying form differs from the others in sense relations. Now, the same kind of findings come from studies tapping form analysis in a different way by looking at shape-based object recognition, showing that we recognize objects by analyzing relative length relations and angular relations among their parts. Interestingly, there's also work showing that object recognition often works best when we're given fragmented arrays that preserve corners, junctions where different lines meet. It's harder to represent objects from arrays that preserve continuous contours and take those corners away. Exactly the opposite of the pattern in the case of navigation. Now, like navigation, the shape recognition representations that are used for recognizing objects are not very accessible to introspection, and you can see that just by looking at all the debates within the literature about what the underlying shape properties are that we use for recognizing things. So it looks like there's at least 3 systematic differences between these 2 core systems of geometry. One uses distance and the other length. One uses left-right direction and the other angle. One operates on continuous surfaces and the other operates on junctions. These properties are complementary, and that suggests that if children could use some symbolic media for combining them, then they might be able to develop a more complete, comprehensive, and abstract geometry. How close am I to 0? 3 minutes, okay. Pictures and maps are one way to combine things. Kids start using pictures early. Probably this work is so beautiful and famous, you probably all know this. They also start navigating by maps very early. So let's see, do kids use representations from core geometry to interpret maps? Now, this is the subject of ongoing research by my student, Moira Dillon. She's been doing studies on 4-year-old children where she gives them a map that shows an overhead view of a triangular structure within a circular room. She actually uses 2 different fragmented triangular environments within that circular room. And in both of them, she simply says to kids, see, she gives them a puppet and says, Big Bird has a favorite place to sit in this room that you're in. Here on the map, this shows where he likes to sit. Can you put him where he likes to sit? And they get neutral positive feedback no matter what they do. Now, in one of these environments, the triangle is presented as an array of extended surfaces without corners, the kind of array the reorientation system likes. And children succeed at placing the object, and they succeed especially well when they get to place the object at the side of the most distinctive distance. The other array presents corners but not extended surfaces. Children succeed at this task as well, and they succeed best at the corner that's most distinctive in angle from the other corners. Now, does their success depend on recruiting core systems of geometry? To begin to approach that question, the same children who were given those 2 map tasks were also given a test of reorientation in rectangular rooms and the test of geometrical form analysis that I just described. And now we can look at relationships among these tasks. First finding. Reorientation and visual form analysis are utterly uncorrelated with each other in this population of children, and other work shows they're also uncorrelated in adults. Spatial ability is not a unitary property. There are different spatial systems, and being good at one does not guarantee that you'll be good at the other. Second, and really surprisingly to me, performance on the 2 map tasks was uncorrelated, even though they used the same map. So children who were really good at using this map to find things in this environment were not any more likely than anyone else to be good at using that map to find things in the other environment. These are 4-year-old children. But the crucial analyses were hierarchical regression analyses that controlled for age and verbal IQ and looked at relations between performance on the core tasks and performance on the maps. We found that reorientation predicted performance at using distance on the map, and one of the aspects of visual form analysis predicted reorientation using angle on the map. Those were the only two significant relationships of the four possible ones. So reorientation did not predict use of corner angles, and visual form analysis did not predict use of extended surfaces. Now, we've now gotten this finding in 3 separate experiments using different symbols. We found it in a study where we used solid rather than fragmented rooms and an attentional manipulation to get kids to focus on sides of distinctive distances or corners of different angles. And Molly has recently found this in a study using perspective line drawings, either of rooms or of objects, rather than maps. In all of these studies, children seem to be drawing on their systems of core geometry for solving these new symbolic tasks. So to close, I've suggested that we have 2 systems of core geometry. I should say at least 2 systems. Nothing in this work precludes the existence of others. One that captures information about distance and direction, the other that captures information about relative length and angle. I've also talked about 2 systems of spatial symbols, pictures and maps, and I've suggested that Euclidean geometry may emerge when children use these symbol systems and also use language, which I haven't talked about, to combine information from the 2 systems of core knowledge. Now, if that's right, then studies of these systems can suggest answers to the questions I started with. What are the starting points? Obviously, I propose the core systems. What changes over spatial cognitive development? I think the geometric information from these systems comes to be productively combined. How does human spatial cognition differ from other animals? I think those differences will emerge in tasks where symbols can be used to recruit these new spatial concepts. And finally, how can we enhance children's geometrical reasoning? The hypothesis is we can do this by exercising the core systems and also by exercising their mappings to symbols and the child's movement from using those symbols to extract one kind of geometric information to using it to extract the other. But is this hypothesis correct? Here are a few unanswered questions. First of all, how is it possible for core systems to be so heavily encapsulated in some respects that it can't pick up on the shape of this rectangle here, but so accessible when you present symbols that the same 2-dimensional lines on paper that don't work here do work as symbols of the environment? How do core geometric properties get mapped to symbols? And once mapped, how do they get combined? You may have noticed that I have not offered any answers to this question, but I end with an optimistic suggestion. I think if you take the kinds of experimental methods that people in this room specialize in, and you put them together with the rich array of techniques used to probe spatial representations from other fields, we're in a really good position to start addressing them. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I closed it. It's still up.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and okay. Yes, you do. Yes. You good? Oops. Hold on. This is.
Oh, we'll just throw this on the floor. Why do we need this?
Oh, thank you.
Sure. Liz will thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to Lynn for her expert technical assistance. And what I want to do today is to talk about not only an alternative perspective on many of the phenomena that Liz has described, but also a whole different approach, I think, to the problem of cognitive development. So what I want to talk about today is the idea that Bayesian approaches best explain the data, much of which you've just seen laid out for you. So like Liz, I have some starting points, and my starting points are magnitude estimation, and I will say more about that. And what I think happens is that you integrate across multiple inputs, both features and geometry. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you select one or the other, but that is explicable in ways that I will describe. But note that this is the opposite of impenetrable modularity. The weightings of the different kinds of cues in the spatial world depend on the salience of the cues and the variability with which they're encoded, and this decays over time very often. And it also depends on cue validity. So the idea of cue validity is an idea of accumulating experience based on distributions. Therefore, it's not just experience of the sort that is symbolically mediated. Now, this is not to deny the importance of symbolic systems. I would be the first to say that language is a wonderful thing. I adore maps. I can't believe SRCD didn't give us a map, a physical map. I like them. But there's more than just that. And this is a part of what I see as renaissance in cognitive development, where we increasingly have Bayesian approaches to other cognitive phenomena. And Scott Johnson, in his edited book, has called this neo-constructivism. Other people are calling this approach rational constructivism. Alison Gopnik and Henry Wellman are just calling it constructivism. But this general approach has been taken to causality and a variety of other phenomena. It's also an approach that has been taken for quite a while with respect to thinking about spatial cognition and thinking about the spatial world. So in 1991, Jane Ellen Huttenlocher, together with Larry Hedges and Susan Duncan, proposed a Bayesian system for encoding spatial location, which I'll say a little bit more in a moment. And then more recently, Ken Cheng, father of the geometric module, wrote with Jane Ellen and Sarah Shuttleworth, who's a wonderful comparative cognition researcher, and John Reiser, about an extended Bayesianism and how that can be used to think about encoding spatial information. And there's lots of work. I think this is a really emerging trend in spatial development in particular by Anna Weissmeyer, who I know is at least at the conference, and Marco Nardini, who I think is somewhere about, that approach a variety of phenomena from this kind of point of view. So that's the way that I situate my work. I want to say quickly that neural systems, I think, are not the issue. So a lot of people want to locate, a particular bit of the brain that's the geometry bit, or a particular bit of the brain that's the featural bit. The crucial issue is whether this information is really combined or selected between. And you can see there might be different areas of the brain that encode, and in Kate Jeffrey's diagram, there's even something that's labeled geometric cue and something that's labeled landmark, but the main point is there's all sorts of arrows joining them, and they work together to support behavior. So although I think neural data is important, the key issue is how the system works. So what I want to talk about today is to first tell you what I mean by a Bayesian approach to space, and then I'm going to talk about some of the problems that I've had with the approach that Liz has taken, although it's evolving, and I think that's interesting. But I think that features are used and integrated with geometry in a way that is incompatible with impenetrable modularity. The developmental change is not caused only by symbolic systems. I've already said those two. But more importantly, I think geometry is not a coherent way to describe the known phenomena. And in fact, Liz has already hinted at that point, but I want to really underline it. I think it's very important. And also that I think the study of reorientation has become a little bit of a niche area, and it needs to be located within the wider field, which it sort of originated from, of spatial cognition. So let's start with Bayesian models. Suppose you hear something. You can roughly localize where it is. At SRCD, somebody might call your name and you look wildly around. You kind of know it's somewhere over there. Our auditory system is not very good at localizing. So there'll be a central trend, but there'll be a distribution. But as you look around, you might see somebody's mouth working, and you might even be able to lip read that it's saying Nora. And what will come up is a much more sort of tight distribution based on vision of where that person is who's hailing you. And so what you will do as you locate them more exactly is that you'll think that they are mainly where vision is telling you, because that's much more accurate. But you may weight that a little bit by auditory. So as you look around, you're going to weight that by the auditory location. Now, that's because of the sort of reliability and variability of vision. But there's also a Bayesian prior here, which is that because we know, based on experience, we may not know consciously, that our vision gives us better localization than audition, we also trust our vision for that reason. This is the basis for ventriloquism. So when people don't literally cast their voice, they just rely on not moving their lips too much, and then the vision of the puppet moving its mouth will take over. But the idea of priors here is that we all went around carrying dummies and casting our voices all the time. We would begin to trust our visual information less and go with our auditory information because it was providing better information. So that's how experience can have an effect. So I want to tell you a little bit about the categorical adjustment model that Jane Ellen and others proposed in 1991. It is very similar to what I just told you about. There's a sort of wide distributed set of spatial localization information that comes from knowing that something is in a category. So it's in the sand pit, it's in the playground area, something like that. The prototypical location will be more or less in the center of that category. You may also remember not only that it's, on a table, to take another example, but that it's, 2 inches from one side and 3 inches from the other dimension and so on and so forth. That's going to fade over time. But you will weight the one or the other depending on how well it's encoded and how much it's decayed over time. So a lot of these experiments were done with the location of dots in circles. And a category that people use is the quadrant of the circle. Let's take the upper left quadrant, and I'll show you how it works. You're shown a dot, and it goes away. And you have a fine-grained coding of some kind of where it is, but it's not perhaps that exact. There's 9 different possibilities. You pick one, but you know it's in the upper left quadrant. And that's kind of the center of the upper left quadrant, but there's maybe 4 possibilities, but you pick one of those. So it's somewhere on the line in between those two, and you pick one of those. And lo and behold, that's where it is in relation to where it really was. So your estimate is very close to where it really was, but it's biased towards the category center. So just as we adjusted our visual by the auditory estimate, we adjust the one by the other, the fine-grained by the category information. Now, this is a long tail, and I just want to assure you that it works not only for other geometric shapes, but also for natural scenes and in the 3-dimensional world. But what I want to turn to now is some developmental work that Jane Ellen and I did a long time ago. This is to illustrate my general approach to the problem of spatial development and how it works within a Bayesian context and how there is change as well as certain starting points in magnitude estimation. So at the time we started our work, a lot of people had taken from Piaget the idea that children were unable to code magnitude in space at all, that they only coded topologically. And what we showed first with toddlers in a continuous space defined by a sandbox, and then also in a sandbox but using looking time techniques, is that that's not true. That infants and also toddlers have an ability to code the magnitude along this sandbox. There's also some distortion here. So you'll see that perfect responding in the sandbox task, the toddler sandbox, would be defined by that line, and those points are very close to the line, but the ones on the left are above the line, and the ones on the right are below the line. And what you see here is the same thing, just sort of tilted, and there's a zero error, and now you can see the distortion more. That's for young kids. For older kids, what they do is not just define the category as in the sandbox, a single category. They subdivide the sandbox into two halves, and therefore the category adjustment is towards the middle of the left half and the middle of the right half. And what that does is make you even more accurate. Not that you weren't accurate before, but now you're really ballistically accurate. So there's evolution in the Bayesian system as the categories get subdivided. Another thing that I was involved in with Elizabeth Sandberg and Jane Ellen, this is Elizabeth's doctoral dissertation, is showing that children before the age of 8 or 9, and this is shades of Piaget, who traced differences to that age, children can't do this along 2 dimensions simultaneously. So this is to say that there are both strong starting points and considerable change of a Bayesian kind. Now, what is this early magnitude estimation system? Recently, in the Spelke lab, but also in Stella Lourenco's hands, and also, although I'm not showing any stimuli, in Sue Carey's hands, it's been shown that length and number and various other such dimensions transfer deeply one to the other. So although I think magnitude estimation is a starting point, it's not just spatial. And in fact, this is one of the criticisms I have of the modularity approach, that it really is number and length, and that those are deeply interconnected. And in fact, one story of development that I'm not going to have time to tell is that I think development consists in the differentiation of these dimensions, which are initially somewhat confabulated. So I also want to mention the extended Bayesian approach that Cheng et al. Proposed in 2007. Integration occurs when there are 2 overlapping distributions. One might be more variable, one might be less variable, and I've described that process. But consider also the case where there are 2 distributions that do not overlap at all. Here you will not integrate. The one place you know it's not is in between those distributions. You'd be insane to integrate. So in that case, you have to select. So you get both integration and selection depending on the situation. So now I want to show you data, some of which are old, some of which are newer, about how features are used and they're integrated with geometry incompatible with impenetrable modularity. An early study in 2001 was done with monkeys, in which the monkeys did use the colored wall. They also used panels at the corners. They also used a colored wall that was not a full colored wall, a little bit smaller colored wall, but they failed to use number 6, the bit of colored wall that's really much smaller. So salience of the feature affects whether or not it's used. All features are not created equal, and I think that's very important in considering the evidence. There's also the data that we also published in 2001 on the larger room, and I call it the larger room because it's not very large. It's 8 by 12 feet. The original room used by Hermer and Spelke is only 4 by 6 feet. It's really very, very small. And toddlers do use the colored wall to reorient in that larger room. That was further replicated and kind of extended a little bit more rigorously with a within room, within kid, random assignment kind of situation when Amy Learmonth went on a postdoc to Arizona and worked with Lynn Nadell, so that 4-year-olds fail to use features in the small room but do successfully use them in the larger room. And this just summarizes those data and other data. We see 0 wouldn't be 0 correct, it would be 0 use of features to take you off the 50-50 split that geometry gives you. On the right, you see the sort of Hermer-Spelke type findings in the small room with an abrupt change between 5 and 6. On the left, you see that there's very considerable feature use even in very, very young toddlers. Now, this is true of other species as well. It's also true of adults. Now, for adults, you have to give them a conflict. You have to make them choose. And you can do this by putting them in a situation where, while you're disorienting them with their eyes closed, you move the feature from one wall to another wall. And you can do this either in a small room or in a larger room. And when you make adults pick, what you find is that in the small room, they like geometry. In the larger room, they like features. So there's something about feature use which requires the larger room to show itself. But it comes. And this shows, first of all, that there is no impenetrable modularity, but I want to put this in the perspective of the fact that the larger room is not nearly as large as that enormous space out there. When you walk around Seattle, it's a lot bigger than 8 by 12 feet. So that's the real, spatial world that we have to operate in. So I think it's a more general finding that features are used and that features are integrated with geometry. Now, we do want a mechanism for how that happens. And in a series of experiments that I won't take the time to describe in detail, again headed by Amy Learmonth, we showed that there are two factors at least, and I think there are actually also some others that I won't mention, that drive this effect of feature use in the larger space. One is something Liz actually mentioned, which is that it's known that hippocampal place cells really primarily fire when you're moving actively around in a space. And it's easier to move in the larger space and you explore more actively. So that's a kind of general comment. The other thing is something that Liz also somewhat alluded to, which is that you can view the feature, in this case the colored wall, from a greater distance when the room is larger because you get farther away from it. And that's important not only in the way that Liz talked about, but for another reason. So let's consider the real world, that world outside. Now, this is not the world that's outside here in Seattle. This is Philadelphia. Some of you may recognize City Hall. The canonical view looking on Broad Street to City Hall is from the south looking northward. This is where everyone gets their wedding photo taken. If you get married in Philadelphia, remember to do that. But this is actually not the view from South Broad looking north. This is the view from North Broad looking south. And there are several different ways you can tell that. One of them is that Billy Penn is facing a different way, for those of you who are aficionados of the statue on top. The portico gate thing is a little bit different, so that's also a sort of featural, if I may say so. It's flattened, although, of course, it has a 3D aspect, but from this distance it looks flat. But what is more important is that I think those are ways that you tell the difference. But what I want to highlight is that another way to tell the difference is that what, until very recently, used to be the Philadelphia Inquirer building is that big white building on the right. It's white, it has a distinctive shape, it has a clock that's pretty flat against it. And what you're doing is knowing the position of it and knowing the position of it vis-a-vis City Hall. So the spatial world in which we navigate consists of various landmarks, distal landmarks located at a distance from us that are interrelated, and that their shape, which is kind of a part of the shape object system that Liz was talking about, because we're viewing it from very far away, and their distance and the interrelationships of each to the other is part of what I would say is spatial cognition, and which drives these various cells that Liz was talking about. Now, I want to now talk about a couple of different lines of research. One is that features can be true reorientation cues. So, as Liz was talking about the ants and so forth, the implication was that features are only used in a kind of paired associate sort of way, that you go to the corner which has a geometric description, but either does or does not have a colored wall or is all white. But these experiments show it's not that, or certainly not only that. I'm not saying you don't use some association, but in an octagon, there's one geometric corner in which there's a colored wall, and I'm just going to use length for now because it's easier in the octagon. The long wall is to the right and it's colored. But there are 3 other corners where the long wall is to the right and the corners are all white. And children as young as 3 can use the colored wall to discriminate among the 3 all-white corners. So this is bona fide a reorientation. And furthermore, even without a geometry, even in a circular environment, as long as there's something on the circular enclosure, a quilt, which is flat and sort of tacked to the curtain, they can use that fabric to discriminate among 3 hiding boxes or among 2 hiding boxes. So they're using features to reorient. Another line of work I want to talk about was started by Jane Ellen together with Stella Lourenco, and this is the case of a square room. So now we have no geometry, but we do have some kind of relative magnitude. So you're going from the smaller, more numerous circles to the larger and less numerous circles. You can also have squares that have categorical distinctions, so 2 different colors or a pattern and no pattern. The categorical stuff is harder to use. The relative information is easier to use. We showed that that was true for mice as well as for kids. And the reason for that, according to Jane Ellen and Stella, is harking back to that magnitude system I told you about, which is that you can map the general more or less onto both the number or the density or whatever the co-varying kinds of qualities are. In a way, when the cues are categorical, it's harder to do that mapping. Now, there's a paper out that Liz didn't mention that suggests that's depth, pseudo-depth, an illusion of depth kind of information. But it's not only that, and in fact, this recent experiment not only controlled for that in a very, very rigorous way, controlling for luminance and all sorts of factors, but added another thing to the mix that I think is very important given that Bayesian framework, which is cue validity. So at the bottom, you have the phenomena that I just told you about, where there's either categorical at the lower left, there's some diamonds and some circles, or there's an ordering of small and large circles. And indeed, you look just at the white bar at the lower left. The children do not succeed with the categorical information, although occasionally they do, like Nardini has gotten them to just be above chance or whatever, but it's a hard situation. On the right, you see that they do succeed above chance with the ordered kind of cues. So that's just what I already told you. But now consider the top panels, because the cue validity here is such that you can choose a single corner. There's a right answer. Chance is now 25%, not 50%. So it's either in the large and small circle case in the upper right, where the 2 large circles are the 2 small circles, or the large circle to the left of the small, or vice versa, and kids succeed, and they succeed with the categorical or with the ordering of the small and large circles. That's the black versus the gray bar in the upper right. But even more importantly, they now succeed much more definitively than ever before with the cues where the circle is to the left of the diamond or to the right of the diamond, because now the cue validity is perfect. Now it will tell you where it is. And this is not with extensive training. This was the very, very few trials. The last thing I want to tell you about harks back to the combination and selection point, and this is Alexandra Twyman's doctoral dissertation, where she, this is an experiment with adults, but it speaks to the predictions of the Bayesian model, which I think alternative models can't really predict this complex pattern of results. So there's a space which has a unique geometry. Each of the corners is completely distinct. The adult stands on the small island in the middle of a circular sand pit which surrounds the adult. And there are features on the wall. And a flag is put into the circular sand pit, so it's a continuous space. The flag is taken away, the adult is disoriented, and the task is to put the flag back where it belongs. So now you can get metric distortions, you can get bias, because you don't have containers, you don't have to go to just, oh, that corner, you can get metric distortions. Now, adults choose If the feature is moved to a completely different wall, because then it's ridiculous, like it's obviously different, they also choose when the feature is moved towards a corner, because that's also very distinctive. But when the feature is moved along the wall, the moderate expansion and the larger expansion, they average geometry and features. So they're behaving just the way the Bayesian model would predict. So in sum, I think the modular architecture just can't explain why feature use depends on salience, why features are used in larger spaces, why features can be true cues for reorientation, why feature use is affected by cue validity, why relative magnitude aids performance even without geometry, why features can be either combined or selected or fail to be selected depending on the instances. So now I want to move on to the issue of symbolic systems. Now, back when the claim was just that it's language, and there was a shadowing experiment that showed that verbal shadowing made adults bad, I showed that it wasn't just that. It's also true that children, if you put them in the small room, that's the large room, the green bars, where they will succeed at going to the correct corner, they switch to the and then you put them in the small room where normally they would be at chance, they start to use the feature. So it takes only 4 trials in the large room before, when you stick them in the small room, they use the features. The same kind of thing is true for adults if you put them in conflict. If you train them in the large room and put them in the small room, they used to use geometry, now they use features. Interestingly, if you train them in the small room where they use geometry, stick them in the large room, they don't use geometry, they go with features. Features are important in the larger space. And we've also done a mouse ringing experiment. There were old data, or even some newer data, as Liz presented, that gave a conflicting pattern about rigid versus malleable development. But we noted that it was all with either birds or fish, and we thought that it would be important to do a mammalian species. So we did a rearing experiment where we reared mice in either a circular container that was marked half blue, half white, or in a rectangular container that did not contain that colored information. And then once they were old enough to test, we tested them with colored distinctive beacons in the 4 corners. This is not the most interesting finding, but it's a little bit of a finding. You'll note that mice are kind of dumb and they take a long time to learn this. But if you were reared in the circle, you learned faster to use the features than if you were reared in the rectangle. What's more important is whether or not you pick up on geometry. When you have those distinctive beacons, you don't need to learn the geometry. But mostly, the animal does learn the geometry. But if you were reared in the circle, you don't learn the geometry. So there's blocking of learning of geometry in the case of the circular reared animals, which shows that there is a need to have some experience with these kinds of things. So let me just move along, because I only have a few minutes, and say that I think geometry is not really the coherent way to describe these phenomena. The original appeal of this in the hands of the grandfather of this literature, Randy Gallistel, was to say that it was evolutionarily important to have this system. And he specifically said, geometry is what's in a geometry textbook, no more, no less. Well, that's turned out not to be true. As Liz said, it doesn't include angle. It doesn't include length, I guess, although I just heard yesterday from Stella Lorenko that she has some doubts about that. But it doesn't include the geometry of separated objects, which are important in the real world. It doesn't include asymmetrical enclosures, and we haven't seen that data yet. But what is the environment of adaptation really like? I told you a little bit about Philadelphia, but Homo sapiens did not adapt in Philadelphia. So angles are not included, length is not included. There's a conflicting literature on whether or not it's the geometry of individual separated objects. Adina Liu has the data on it not being in the lower left, the asymmetric enclosures. And I'll just skip over that. This is a wonderful Psych Bulletin article by Adina Liu. The title is good, Looking Beyond the Boundaries, Time to Put Landmarks Back on the Cognitive Map. And Adina is the one who found these wonderful pictures, which show that in our natural environment, landmarks may be all you get. Look at that picture at the top. There's no geometry. Now, that tree may not be a very good landmark, maybe it'll get blown over, but it's all you get, and you would be not well advised to ignore it. And furthermore, the boundaries are often partial. They're often irregular. They aren't these incredibly regular, fully enclosed. Even when you break them up and put them a bit at a distance, you don't get that in the real world. So it wouldn't be adaptive. And I think that's a really big problem. So the study of reorientation really needs to relate to the rest of spatial cognition. Egocentric and allocentric cues are usually combined. We block egocentric cues by disorientation, but there's a whole combination story when you're not disoriented, which after all, thankfully, doesn't happen that often. And geometric cues don't influence anything very much as long as you're not disoriented. And a whole area of literature that I'd love to tell you more about is that beyond geometry and features, there's slope and there's other gradient cues, olfactory gradients. We have a lousy sense of smell, but we can tell when we're getting closer to the bakery. But other, species do better than us. Those are neither geometry nor features. So there's a ton of phenomena. They all need to be explained by a successful theory. I don't have time to tell you about them all, but my contention is that Bayesian approaches to cognitive development in general and to spatial development in particular provide the best way forward. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Both talks were fabulous, and what we're going to do now is have time for a little discussion and questions. So if people have questions, we have a mic, and I want to see. Did everyone get lost? Okay.
I'll ask a question. Great talks. Thank you very much. So we wanted to comment on there's extensive literature on sex differences in spatial cognition. I would just like to open it up and see if you have any comments on that.
There are. Not in this. There are in mental rotation, but not in this. What were you going to say?
Sure, Scott. So
Thank you.
this is actually something that for various sporting reasons I've been led to look at in our data. And I think that what we find is not only are there no overall sex differences in, first of all, spatial ability is not a unitary thing. So one wouldn't be able to look for overall sex differences in spatial ability. You have to look ability by ability. And when we do that, what we find, first of all, is no overall differences, particularly testing young kids in these tasks. And also great convergence across the sexes. So for example, in that geometrical form analysis task where there was all different items and some are much easier and others are much harder, every single item that's hard for males at any age is also hard for females at that age. There's a very tight correlation between performance in the sexes. And then there are a few items that will consistently favor girls and a few that will consistently favor boys, but not to the extent that they're easy for one sex and hard for the other. I actually think there's enormous convergence in the starting points for spatial cognitive development. And I say this acknowledging nevertheless the evidence that you and others have that if you look at infants in these ambiguous situations where you're not asking them to recognize, analyze the properties of a form in one shot, but they're seeing graduated changes in angle, you can pick up subtle sex differences in a case like that.
Exactly what she said.
We agree on something.
All right.
The only mic we have, there's someone in the back. Okay.
So I enjoyed both talks, and I've enjoyed watching your back and forth in the literature for the last 15 years or so, maybe even a little bit longer. And I guess I feel like the two talks almost talked past each other. I didn't sort of get a good synthesis of where you agree and where you disagree. So I wondered if you could each maybe comment on each other's talks to give us a sense of what you thought about each other.
Oh, okay. I have a slide on that. And I didn't tell him to ask this question. Okay, areas of agreement. I think that one area of agreement is that there are beginnings in magnitude estimation, although I think we disagree as to, well, I don't think we disagree as to whether it's general. I think we might disagree as to what it means, that it's, that you get these translations from length to number and so on and so forth. We agree that human symbolic systems are tremendously important. I just think they're not the only thing. I think we agree about the importance of surfaces. I can't imagine a spatial world in which surfaces were not important. And I think we also agree about the idea that object structure and spatial relations are quite different. In fact, that sort of typology is something in the meta-analysis on a completely different topic that David Utall and I proposed that sort of embodies that. I just noted that distal landmarks were kind of both. But those were my nominations for areas of agreement. There may be others.
Yeah, let me underline a few areas of agreement as well, and then maybe it would be useful to focus on some of the disagreements. We don't disagree that children and animals use non-geometric cues. And maybe here I can focus the disagreement. The disagreement is over whether there's a unitary, fully interconnected system that's assessing these cues at one and the same time, or whether there's more structure to the mind, such that some properties of the environment are processed by separable systems that can be studied in multiple ways, including, sorry, this is giving feedback, including looking at differential localization in the brain, looking at different conditions of elicitation in animals, like are they trained or not, or in children, like is the child's attention called to a landmark or not. So I think the disagreement is really not about what kinds of behavioral performance can one see in a child or in an animal, but the much more interesting, or an adult for that matter, but I think the much more interesting cognitive question is the question, how is the mind organized such that we see animals responding both to the properties of objects and to the properties of layouts? I think at this point, neither of us has the full answer to this question. What I think is most productive is that there's a process for moving forward and getting closer to that answer. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah, and in fact, it's, ooh, is this on or, yeah, okay. I think it's super exciting. There's a paper, I'll just note that I came out in Science from the Moser Lab in Norway using optogenetics, which shows that place cells receive input from grid cells, from head direction cells, and from boundary cells, and that they respond to all of those three cells in a very complex way, which isn't simply summative. So this is an initial stab at this. This is just using optogenetics, so it's not fully integrated with any kind of computational approach. To my mind, it suggests that there's integration at a very fundamental cellular level, but that's the kind of thing I think we're going to be able to get more of a handle on as these techniques come of age.
So I also would like to thank you both for wonderful talks, and I wonder if John Spencer and I were at the same talks, because I don't think that you really talked past each other. I think that areas of disagreement were quite clear, and that is whether or not modularity is in fact what we observe in children. So my question is this. Given that science is an exercise of maintaining some beliefs and revising other beliefs, My question for both of you, what kind of evidence would convince you that modularity is wrong for you, and what kind of evidence would convince you that no, modularity is right?
I actually am pretty close to convinced that modularity is wrong about one thing, and that is that if one imagined that the system for reorientation were completely encapsulated, so encapsulated that although it contains representations of distance, we have no access to those distance representations, then I don't see how a child could use distance, could harness that system to use distance to navigate by a map, by a symbolic map, by marks on paper. I mean, for me, the biggest mystery right now, and I think possibly the key to this question, what's special about human cognition, is that these early developing core systems of knowledge that we share with other animals and that seem to be inaccessible to us for purposes of conscious reflection and that pass many of the tests that Jerry Fodor laid out for modularity. So there's information that other parts of the brain and mind are aware of that they can't use and so forth. These systems nevertheless are accessible for mapping to symbols. I think that's what the new work is showing. It's not what I expected to see, and I think it would, if that turns out to be right, it's going to require a real reconceptualization of what the starting points for development are. I don't think it's going to say that the mind is one wholly interconnected, unstructured entity at the starting state, and that structure then emerges later. I think we have lots of evidence that that's not the case, that there's interesting structure in the mind that we can work with in trying to solve this puzzle of how we come to use symbols and through them to go beyond our initial ways of construing the world and to construe it in new ways. But that's a way in which I already think the most recent data we've been getting is showing real limits to the notion of modularity and explaining development.
Well, hey, I mean, that's one of the things that I was most, troubled by in the position. The other being that symbolic systems are the only thing. I mean, I never would have doubted that symbolic systems are important or that it's an important area of investigation to work out how they're mapped onto the non-symbolic kind of knowing that we bring to the table. I also think that the object system and the geometry system, one of the things that I think is very interesting in Liz's latest formulation is that you're calling both of them a kind of geometry. And just like I'm not sure about the term modularity, which is often used very imprecisely, I think one of the things that's good about what Liz has done is that she has adopted a very rigorous Fodorian definition because it has to mean something. A lot of people just use it to mean brain specialization, and that's clearly dumb, I think. I mean, just say brain specialization. If you mean brain specialization, just say so. So I think that there are points of rapprochement in terms of basically, I think a distal landmark is both an object with a shape and a feature, and that taken together, they form a, if you want to call it a geometry, but something that drives the place cell system, and that continuous surfaces are particularly potent cues of that kind.
I think the evidence actually is against that point, that you can introduce landmark objects into the environment that the rats are navigating around in, or for that matter, now that there's evidence from neuroimaging of place cells in humans, you can introduce objects into virtual navigation in human virtual navigation tasks.
Yeah.
And they don't respond to the objects. They respond to the large extended surfaces and distance and direction from those surfaces, but they're remarkably impervious to the existence and positions of objects. So if you're looking for a fight, I think we've got one here.
No, and this is where we should have Neil Burgess here, because really my fight is with Neil. Those Daler and Burgess studies, they are not about landmarks. Those little pylons that are within the enclosure, those are not landmarks. And the so-called distal, they kind of look like distal landmarks when you see those things, they're mountains. They are rendered at infinity. No, those studies are uninformative, and studies of that ilk are completely uninformative.
Okay, so
We've just gotten things going, and thank you very much. I think we'll have to end. Thanks.